Right now, we have another politician, and it's important that we are having these conversations in an atmosphere like this, where there can be an honest dialogue about the very changing and tumultuous atmosphere in which today both politicians have to practice their politics, and the rest of us who are demanding questions of them, demanding a new deal, a new code of ethics, a new language, not just harking back to where we began, but something that is commensurate with the 65 years of independence and where it has brought us to. Today, we have Manish Tiwari, a very young politician who has had the singularly difficult job of defending his party's positions through an extremely difficult time, and who has just been made the INB Minister. Please welcome Manish Tiwari.
That's what the
Manish, our session is called Half Ticket, Power and What We Make of It. You've actually won on full tickets many times, so it's an unfair name for the session. But when we named it Half Ticket, the idea was really to discuss the very complicated nature of power, in modern India, in this decade. And I think the riddles that politicians, we all have a good time politician bashing. But today I want to understand both your genuine constraints and also what are genuine, absences that politicians today and your party may be suffering from. So to begin with, Manish, this past 2 years has had a lot of diatribe against politicians. There is a real loss of faith, a real sense that the language of politicians and the language of people demanding accountability or demanding a kind of conduct out of politicians are just not matching. The gap is not narrowing. Would you concede that? And what do you think is behind that?
Since I'm not wearing my spokesperson's hat, and first of all, let me congratulate you for having a full house after lunch, because I've conferenced enough in my life to really discern that if you have a full house after lunch, you've got something happening in this festival. So first of all, let me congratulate you for that. If your question is, and if I understand it correctly, that is the nature of the discourse a little more rabid than what it usually is? Honestly, as somebody who's been a political activist now for almost 3 decades, I don't think so. Because in the 90s or in the 80s, and some of the elder people who are sitting here, maybe in the 70s or the 60s, may have seen equally divisive or equally rabid politics in different paradigms and in different frames. But yes, what you're seeing today is because of the complete transformation of the media space, the amplification and the magnification of those images, and they being beamed into people's homes, whereby the impact is much greater. So if you measure it in terms of impact, yes, there has been a paradigm change in terms of the ability of the discourse, howsoever divisive or separatist it might be, or howsoever, I really do not want to be definitional, but yes, it's reached a greater number of people. And to that extent, I do concede that possibly at times, their aspirations and what they expect out of people in public life and what we are able to deliver, there is definitely a gap.
But I was, two follow-ups to that, Manish. One is let's remove the media because the conduct of the media is a whole separate session, and we can touch a bit on it, but I agree. Sometimes it's too shrill. It's not interested in the answers. It's only interested in the questions.
I'm not even making a value judgment.
I'm making one, But let's remove the media from the. Let's just assume that the media wasn't there. Are you comfortable with the language of politics and your fraternity today?
Well, I think the language of politics in this country, has always been shrill. It's always been very competitive. What I'm not so worried about is really the language of politics. What I'm really worried about is the impact which it has had on our institutions. This lockdown that we see in Parliament, and that's not something which is of 2 or 3 years vintage. It's now been carrying on in different forms and manifestations over the last 2 decades. Its impact on our legislative assemblies and, even on the third tier of our democratic system. What does it really augur for in terms of the efficacy of representative democracy? That is what really worries me. And to that extent, if the language is shrill, if the discourse is divisive, it does tend to weaken the faith of people in these institutions.
But Manish, it's not just what is wrong with me?
The dissonance.
The divisiveness.
The divisiveness.
The divisive. Sorry. Is there another word for that? Well, let's opt for shrill. It's not just the shrill or the polarizing, thank you for that, the polarizing nature of politics today that I'm talking about, but I think the evasiveness of it, when there is exposure, when there are questions asked, let's forget about even the actual event of, say, corruption or of the failure of duty, but the response to exposure. Are you comfortable with that? And do you think it compares with democratic traditions in some of the, the Western world?
Well, there are 2 aspects to that. One is the expose per se, and number 2, what are the criminal implications of that expose? Let's take corruption, for example, right? I think the media, does have a role as the custodian of certain societal values to go and expose something, which has an element of malfeasance. But I think, after that expose has been done, and there is sufficient prima facie evidence which has been established, that's when the judicial processes have to take over. The important thing in this entire discourse is to really find the golden median, that where does the role of the media end and where does the role of the judicial processes take over. And I think where we are getting it wrong is that, when we sort of try and extend ourselves and become the judge, jury, and prosecutor, that is a role which personally, as somebody who's been a lawyer or, who's been trained as a lawyer, is something which I am not personally comfortable with. Coming to the moral aspect of it, I completely agree with you that, when you are in public life, you have to measure up to certain moral standards. Maybe those moral standards are higher or should be higher than if you're not in public life. So under those circumstances, if you are confronted with evidence which prima facie appears to be correct, the right thing to do is to step down and allow then the judicial processes either to exonerate you or to hold you guilty. But the difficulty I find, and again, I'm not being judgmental, is that somewhere that golden median, we've not been able to find in the last 2 or 3 decades.
But Manish, before we switch gears, I just want to pursue this a little more. This last year and a half has been a season, it's not just last year and a half, say a couple of years, has been a season of great exposes, and the immediate response, and that is why I'm not even going into the merits of what I'm really talking about is the response of the political class. And the shrillness that you're talking about, this desire for a witch hunt, it comes out of repeated frustration. that when there is an expose, the first response is evasiveness or is denial. There is no sense of, to use your word, prima facie, to say, doesn't matter who's behind this, doesn't matter what the motive is. If somebody is saying there is something wrong, let's examine it. Why don't we even have that base level of public ethics in our life anymore?
Well, that's a fair point that you make. And I would concede you that, but without going into specifics, if you look back over the past 2 years or the past 3 years, where prima facie there is evidence which has emerged, which needs to be examined. You know, we as the Congress party or we as a government, you know, have asked people to step down. Inquiries have been instituted. So therefore, you know, to that extent, you know, we've tried to measure up to the expectations which people have. If we are falling short, then possibly there is something that we need to introspect about. But I guess the standard operating procedure under these circumstances, if you're in public life, is that if you're confronted with something which is not, you know, totally defamatory, totally malicious, you know, totally over the board or over the top, then, you know, I think it's just fair to step aside and get yourself exonerated through a judicial process.
You know, I wish you were making an official statement when you said that, you know.
Well, I think I was, you know, alluding to the code of conduct that we've been trying to follow. And this is essentially the standard operating procedure which we've followed. But, you know, where you have situations where individuals out of political partisanship or institutions who've appropriated for themselves a role larger than what they're supposed to be playing, if they completely go over the top, I think then there has to be some self-correcting mechanism which also limits them and makes them stay within their constitutional remit and constitutional boundary. And coming to the political space, I think the same standards of morality then also need to circumscribe those people who are making those allegations in the first place. You know, the basic standard of proof or the basic standard of prima facie evidence is something which I think everybody needs to adhere to.
But that's not something I'll argue with, Manish. As journalists, you know, I'm uncomfortable with just an atmosphere of allegation and accusation that is not based on fact and on producible facts, you know. So one is, but let's forget even the environment of allegations. Even when facts are produced, I think there's been too much of a history of just no action being taken, you know. And I want to come back to that. But just to switch to a slightly personal note, Manish, you know, you're a lawyer. You could have had a very productive career. Perhaps you still might if your party's not in power anymore.
That's fair. The cycle of democracy is unpredictable, but I think we should measure up.
But that was just an aside.
That's all right.
I wanted to ask you a question that I think pertains to all of us. Why did you enter politics? What made you want to join?
I think, you know, that's a story which is slightly long and convoluted, you know, which I would not like to go into very great detail. But suffice to say, I think it was more circumstantial. It was more because when we grew up on the sidelines of a very divisive, a very separatist debate which engulfed Punjab in the 80s. So therefore, you know, when you cut your political teeth in that sort of an environment, it possibly, you know, makes you reflect on some of the core values on which the whole Indian state was founded. And I think when you do believe that pluralism and democracy are some of the ideals which are worth fighting for, both as an individual, and if you do believe that you know, that has a certain political value in the life of a nation, I guess it's, you know, worth stepping into public life.
Manish, some years ago, there was a young politician who, on the day that he won his election from his constituency, I happened to speak to him, and he said he was feeling incredibly depressed, even having won, because of the nature of the whole electoral process and what it takes to win a constituency. Very often when you talk to politicians, just personally, privately, not when they're in their official capacity, they talk about almost the inevitability of corruption, the structural corruption that has just creeped into our system. And we might all shout at each other, but unless we begin to address some of this, it's not going to change. Is there an inevitability to the corruption in political life? And when almost across parties people feel it, individually good people feel it, why are we not even beginning to address this essential canker in our system?
Well, if you're talking about campaign finance reform, or if you're talking about electoral finance reform, or the manner in which political parties are funded, you absolutely make a fair point. If any member of the assembly or if any member of parliament tells you that he comes elected within a 25 lakh ceiling, then possibly he's being more than economical with the truth. So therefore, there is.
In fact, this morning, Praful Patel openly said that, yes, we need money, unaccounted money, to win elections. When we are all talking about this...
Well, I don't think it's really a question of unaccounted or accounted. If you were to rationalize campaign finance laws, if you were to look at a fresh construct of electoral finance, I think a lot of the aberrations that we are worried about to some extent would get mitigated, because no country in the world has been able to get it absolutely 100% bang on in terms of electoral finance. And before I came to government, the one thing that I was working on personally, I have done two private members' bills earlier, one to liberalize the legislative space in terms of the anti-defection law. The other was to put our intelligence agencies on some kind of a legislative footing. So what we were working on at this point in time was essentially a draft for a model campaign finance law for this country. And I think going forth, if you want to fix the problems of representative democracy, if you want to fix the electoral process, that should be priority number one on everybody's agenda. Personally speaking, I've been flagging it. Why is there traction, or why is there no traction on this? Why is it that notwithstanding the Indrajit Gupta committee report, the Dinesh Goswami committee report before that, and various other initiatives, things have not moved forward? Honestly, I don't have an answer to that. But I would caveat that by saying, this is the one thing that we really need to fix.
We often talk amongst ourselves that actually India desperately needs something equivalent to the New Deal. There is a real need to reinvent politics, public life, the ground rules on which we are functioning. And sometimes there's a sense that maybe the political class doesn't feel the same sense of anxiety that a lot of other people feel, that there's an out-of-step nature to it, But those are big topics, Manish. So I'm going to come to another, which is corruption. It's been the big bear. Do you feel that one even has a common understanding of what constitutes corruption anymore? There is conflict of interest, there is misuse of discretionary power. Unless one is just caught red-handed, we've just had Rajat Gupta's case, where something as small as just passing off insider information that happens on a daily highway traffic in India, that wouldn't be considered corruption. But we've had such a high-profile case in America over that. So what today do you think constitutes corruption in India?
Well, I think you've defined it yourself, and you've defined it very well. The misuse of discretion, the abuse of power, the criminality of illegal gratification. That is really what constitutes corruption. Conflict of interest, I entirely agree with you. You should not have airline owners serving on the Civil Aviation Consultative Committee, on the Civil Aviation Standing Committee. You should not have owners of coal mines and steel mines serving on the Coal Consultative Committee. You shouldn't have lawyers serving on the Standing Committee of Law and Justice. So therefore, conflict of interest, is something both in the executive and the parliamentary sense, a matter of how you view it individually. And I think the method of addressing it as we go along, in the legislative space, it's at least to have a register, which I think, something of to that extent exists in the Rajya Sabha, where you declare interest, where you participate in a debate, where you possibly feel that there's going to be a conflict of interest. And in the executive, it is clearly circumscribed, by the Prevention of Corruption Act and various other statutes, which specifically deal with these areas. Even what you talked about, insider trading. Now, under the capital markets regulations, the SEBI Act, insider trading is a crime. The fact is that we've not been able to, have a conviction on that, does not essentially make it legal. But I guess as we go along, as processes get more transparent, you will have, cases with regard to even conflict of interest in the corporate space coming out more and more into the open.
Manish, I'm going to ask you a question that might be difficult to answer, but, we all know that actually there's been an inspired generation of leaders that laid the foundation. So every institution we need, and that has partly been our resistance to the Anna Hazare movement, every institution already exists. Every combination of oversight and regulation already exists. They need to function, So beyond the point, we discussing what should be is irrelevant. It already exists. What, to your mind, in the last 2 years, would amount to corruption cases in public life? Can you name a couple that you say, yes, those were corruptions?
Shoma, the reason why I refrain from doing so is for the simple reason, is for the simple fact that a large number of those issues are sub judice. I don't think criminal jurisprudence.
No, that's unfair.
That's fine. I'm quite used to that. You see, the reason I say that is because I don't think that the standards of criminal jurisprudence are different for a public servant and an ordinary individual. Criminal jurisprudence, as it stands constituted, says that you're innocent until proven guilty. If I am going to start pronouncing guilt from here and say, well, this is a corruption case, that is a corruption case, this man is guilty, that man is guilty, I don't think, I'm really being even fair to what I've been professionally trained to do. And that's why I said that why standards in public life should be different is precisely because of this reason, because you've stepped up to serve. And if you've stepped up to serve and you're confronted with a set of allegations, the right thing to do is step aside, allow the judicial processes to take over, and that's the way any civilized society based upon the rule of law should function.
No, in all fairness, Manish, that's a good answer to a bad question, a tough question.
Well,
because, no, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm in agreement with you that until one is proven guilty, you have to be taken to be innocent. Unfortunately, that only pertains to a certain class of people, and that's not just politicians, it includes us in this hall. We've had a lot of people in this hall talking about the working classes, the underclasses, tribals, Dalits, and Muslims, to whom that democratic principle doesn't extend. And that is a great poverty in our democracy today.
Which I completely concede. I think the one difficulty that we have as we go across the income paradigms and you get into lower income groups or you get into marginalized sections of society, their access to the justice system is unfortunately prevented by, and I would not hate using that word, institutional bias, even the state at times. I mean, I completely concede that. And that's the one thing that we need to fix, that in large parts of this country, the only face of the Indian state which people should see should not only be olive green and khaki. So that's one thing which seriously needs to be fixed, because if you are a society based upon the rule of law, then whether it is the first man in the first row or the last man in the last row, his ability to be able to access the justice system and get some semblance or some modicum of relief, I think is extremely paramount to a functional democracy.
Manish, another trick question, and I know that I refuse to tell you what this conversation was about because even I didn't know until 5 minutes ago.
That's all right.
But you've been talking about this culture of allegation against politicians. Can I turn that on your head and say that politicians have a similar culture of allegations against anybody who disagrees with them? Primary being people from the ground, activists, and let's take Kudankulam, where there's been a protest, immediately the government has alleged that there's a foreign hand behind it. Would you accept that that's an unfair allegation, similar to the ones that are hurled at all of you? Or not similar, dissimilar from the ones that are hurled at all of you?
Shoma, had this been before the 28th of October, I would have possibly expressed myself a little more, in a little more forthright manner. Unfortunately, if I were to expound or propound, beyond the parameters of what somebody in government should be, it may be misconstrued. But having caveated my remarks, I just want to make two short points. The first is that the one thing which can stop India from achieving its growth potential is the energy deficit. We produce about 135, 140,000 megawatts of power. As we go from 2012 to 2032, this is going to go up to 400,000 or 500,000 megawatts. If you historically look at it, our energy curve has been the same as most other developing countries: hydrocarbons, intermediates, and renewables. Now, if you were to juxtapose or contextualize these two paradigms into the last 3 decades, in the 70s, you had hydel projects being opposed because people felt that there was environmental degradation, a large amount of villages, a large amount of land will get swamped. Then in the 80s, when you experimented with super thermals, those super thermals were opposed. 90s, it came to, nuclear power, and nuclear power started getting opposed in the first decade of the 2000s. And unfortunately, I'm not sounding conspiratorial. Sorry, I'm getting that wrong. But the one common thread which runs through all these agitations is that the agitators have stayed the same. So therefore, I think at some point in time, you need to get this balance right. Do we need energy or don't we need energy? And if we need energy, shouldn't we have the complete mix? Or should it be that we confine ourselves to one particular source of energy? And there, in the case of Kudankulam, all right, you decide to go and protest. I'll just take one more minute. You decide to go and protest. You take your protest to the High Court. The High Court holds against you. You then take your protest to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court holds against you. And then still, you decide not to give up. So therefore, if your attitude is that my way or the highway, then I don't think any sovereign nation can function on those terms.
Manish, I have to say it's it's very disappointing to hear you speak this, especially to ask why the protesters haven't changed. Maybe it's because it's their politics. And the question I asked you was, why do you assume there's a foreign hand behind it?
I never said foreign hand. I never said foreign hand.
But that was my question.
I never used the word foreign hand. I'm only saying...
You said I'm conspiratorial because why have they not changed?
No. I said while the issues may have kept changing, the activists remain the same. Legitimately, you can argue that their politics can keep changing. I have no...
No, I'm saying their politics has remained the same. They're asking for environmental concern, justice, displacement, rehabilitation,
Their politics may have remained the same. I entirely agree with you, and maybe the issues have evolved. That's a fair point, but at the end of the day, how do you balance out the equities? If you have to provide primary energy to 560 million people in this country who do not have access to it, aren't you as a state entitled to get the rational mix right? And that's what we are attempting to do. After all, when we achieve the full potential of our nuclear power, it's going to be, what, 4% or 6% of our energy mix?
Manish, the energy debate is not one that we can have here. I disagree a lot with what you're saying, but we can't get into that right now. This session really was to discuss the language of politics because each issue is a whole, another domain. I think it's a troubled time in Indian politics, and I know that every generation feels that. I think back in 1970 or 1960s, people felt the country was falling apart, and we're still feeling that, but we're here. But it is disappointing that political forces and political leaders seem to be in opposition to people. That if there is a disagreement, then it seems as if it's non-compliance, and I don't think democracies were meant to be about non-compliance. I'm sorry I get the last word on this, so I really hope that because so many young people are coming into ministries and ministerships, that at the very least, and when I say new language of politics, I mean a new language of
Shoma,
politics.
disagreement does not mean non-compliance. Disagreement means arriving at a certain modus vivendi so that all of us together can move forward. Disagreement is not something which should really hold us back or make us stand still. So therefore, when we disagree with somebody, essentially, we are not looking them down or talking down to them. All that we are trying to do is see if we can find a viable modus vivendi which both of us can live with and go forth. Because our remit or our mandate as a government, and there may be another government tomorrow, it may be us again, and that really depends upon the people, but the remit of every government is to try and do as much as it can to better the quality of life for 1.2 billion Indians. So that is the essential remit, and I think that's where if you have a disagreement as to how do you do it, the right method in a democracy is to find the modus vivendi, the golden median or the balance so that we can move forward.
I still get the last word. And the last word is that I think we've been brought, Ashish Nandy, one of the best sociologists, a polymath in our country, has said that we are now moving towards not just being a democracy anymore, but a cephocracy. And that means that democracy is just coming down to being electoral politics. And I hope that political class led by young ministers like you will now understand that the conversation with the people cannot just be on election day, but continuing in the 5 years that we ask you to govern us. Thank you, Manish.
I give you the last word. Thanks.